All right, everyone, welcome, settle in. Let's get right into it, because today's masterclass explainer is, honestly, it's a fascinating look at human behavior. We're going to explore the lies we tell ourselves, why we tell them, and the actual hard science behind our daily self-deceptions, all through the lens of a very ancient story. But first, a quick question to start us off. Think about it. Have you ever completely bombed a test, or maybe struck out on a date, or didn't get that job you really applied for and almost immediately decided, you know what, I didn't even want it anyway? Why do we do that? Why is it our literal first instinct to just rewrite our own desires the very second we face defeat? Well, here is a quick look at our syllabus for today's explainer. We're starting with an ancient fable as our baseline clinical study. Then we'll move through the hard science of cognitive dissonance, expand into modern behavioral psychology, and finally wrap up with a pretty hard truth that we all need to accept. So, moving right into section 1, the clinical case study. Let's open our lecture today with an observation dating all the way back to the 6th century BCE. I really want you to look at Aesop's famous fable not just as some old children's story, but as a profound observation of human psychology. Our subject here is a hungry fox just wandering through a vineyard. As he's walking, he spots this beautiful, juicy bunch of ripe grapes hanging on a trellis way up high above his head. They look absolutely delicious. His mouth immediately starts to water, and he says to himself, I must have those grapes. So he steps back, takes a running start, and jumps just as high as he possibly can. But he completely misses. Now, the fox doesn't just give up right away. He jumps again and again. Each time he leaps into the air with absolutely all of his strength, but the prize is just barely out of reach. Finally, completely exhausted and defeated, he sits down. But here's the catch. Instead of admitting that he just isn't a good enough jumper, he turns away and says, you know, those grapes are probably sour anyway. I don't want them. And he just struts away, pretending he isn't disappointed at all. Which brings us to section 2, diagnosing sour grapes. All right, class, let's put on our behavioral analyst hats for a second. Why did the fox lie instead of just admitting defeat? Consider how the 18th century translator Samuel Croxall adapted the fox's dialogue. He wrote, "Let whoever wants them take them. They're just green and sour anyway." See, the fox dismisses the grapes completely just to protect his own fragile ego. It is so much easier to despise what you can't get than to actually admit your own limitations. And this brings us to an absolutely crucial definition. Sour grapes is the psychological mechanism of pretending that something you can't have is simply not worth having. It perfectly illustrates our human propensity to devalue an unattainable goal just to cope with the sting of failure. Moving on to section 3, cognitive dissonance defined. So we all do this, right? But what is actually happening physically in the brain to trigger this specific reaction? The real academic turning point of our lecture today is Leon Festinger's 1957 theory of cognitive dissonance. Festinger revealed that when our ideas, beliefs, or behaviors contradict one another, it produces a severe psychological tension, and we are desperately trying to resolve this tension. We'll do almost anything, including blatantly lying to ourselves just to restore that internal harmony. Let's actually map out the exact psychological mechanism using our fox. Step 1. He desires the unattainable grapes. Step 2. He experiences physical failure. Step 3. This creates a massive clash. He wants them, but he can't have them, which results in psychological discomfort or dissonance. And finally, step 4. He rationalizes the failure by changing his belief about the grapes entirely just to reduce that mental tension. Next up, section 4, sweet lemons and anticipatory rationalization. Let's expand our lesson into what happens when we anticipate an outcome in the future. Because it turns out, we don't just rationalize the past. A fascinating 2002 study by researchers Kay, Jimenez, and Jost explored how we actually adjust our current desires based on how likely we think future events are to happen. We literally proactively protect our egos. Notice the brilliant contrast between the two distinct mechanisms they highlight here. We all know sour grapes, devaluing an unattainable outcome so you aren't disappointed. But then think about sweet lemons. This is where we subjectively elevate a bad or unwanted outcome simply because we realize it's inevitable. It's like we force ourselves to love a subpar reality just because we know we're stuck with it. The researchers tested this neutrally during the highly intense 2000 Bush-Gore election, and the results were wild. They found that highly involved partisans would literally derogate their own preferred candidate if defeat seemed likely. Classic sour grapes. But even crazier, they would actually elevate their opinion of the opposing candidate if their victory seemed certain. A perfect example of sweet lemons. We mentally prepare ourselves for the reality we just can't control. All right, moving into section 5, modern behavioral psychology. So, how does this ancient fable and Festinger's psychological theory apply to the everyday decisions you and I make out in the real world? Well, let's see how this plays out in the modern marketplace. Take a look at this 2012 study from the Journal of Management Research. They analyzed post-purchase cognitive dissonance among consumers in the Kulnag metropolitan area. And it turns out, we're basically playing the fox every single time we go shopping. When a consumer buys a product that clashes with external factors, things like family expectations, religious values, cultural norms, political ideology, or even peer group influence, they experience immense cognitive dissonance. Just like the fox wrestling with his desires and abilities, modern consumers face massive internal conflict when their actions clash with external pressures. It basically forces them to either return the product or drastically rationalize their purchase just to feel okay about it. Finally, Section 6, Accepting the Hard Truth. Class, as we near the end of our syllabus today, let's pull everything we've learned into one final, actionable takeaway. Understanding this mechanism is really only half the battle, because the true secondary moral of Aesop's fable isn't just a clinical observation of our flaws, it's a harsh warning. Mental resilience does not come from protecting your ego. True resilience comes from accepting the hard truth of our failures, rather than just hiding behind comfortable excuses. You're never going to learn to jump higher if you convince yourself you never wanted the grapes to begin with. So as we wrap up today's explainer, I want to leave you with a final exam question of sorts. Think about it. The next time you face a high trellis and a goal that seems totally out of reach, and you jump and fall flat on your back, are you going to cry sour grapes, or are you going to accept reality, study your failure, and figure out a better way to jump? Something to think about. Class dismissed.